Scientists have found 10 extinct creatures so weird that one of them grew a boomerang for a head, another developed scissor teeth, and a third breaks every rule of flight. But I've saved the most impossible one for the end because you literally are not even going to believe that this once existed. Starting with the DIPLOCAULUS, this is a creature that solved the problem of getting eaten by making itself physically impossible to swallow. DIPLOCAULUS was this amphibian that lived around 270 million years ago. At some point, evolution looked at it and said, you know what you need? A head shaped like a boomerang. And I'm not being dramatic here. This thing's skull had these massive horn projections sticking out sideways, giving it a head wider than its entire body. Picture trying to eat a pizza that's been folded into a triangle, and you'll get the idea of what predators were dealing with. Now, you might think that this was nature just being weird for the sake of being weird, but DIPLOCAULUS was actually playing some serious evolutionary chess. Those head wings weren't there just for show. They were a death prevention system. When something tried to bite down on this guy, it would literally get stuck trying to fit the boomerang head down its throat. But wait, it gets weirder. Scientists think those head projections also worked as underwater steering equipment. DIPLOCAULUS could tilt its massive head up or down to catch water currents and basically fly through rivers without using its stubby little legs. So not only was it uneatable, but it was also cruising around like some kind of organic hydrofoil. The most interesting part though, this defense system was only partially effective. We know this because DIPLOCAULUS fossils are covered in bite marks. So clearly some predators looked at this walking boomerang and thought challenge accepted, which means somewhere in the Permian period, there were creatures dumb enough to try eating what amounts to a living coat hanger. These things were everywhere too. Texas and Oklahoma are absolutely littered with DIPLOCAULUS fossils, which tells us that despite looking completely ridiculous, this design worked well enough to keep them around for millions of years. And here's what really gets me. DIPLOCAULUS survived multiple extinction events with a head that made it look like it was wearing a permanent hat made of bone. Meanwhile, countless normal looking creatures went extinct. Evolution has a sense of humor, and apparently it's pretty dark. The whole setup was so successful that DIPLOCAULUS just kept making its head wider and wider over time, because if you're gonna commit to being impossible to eat, you might as well go all in. But making yourself too wide to swallow is nothing compared to turning your mouth into actual scissors. EDESTUS took one look at regular shark teeth and decided that wasn't nearly horrifying enough. This thing had two massive curved blades jutting out of its mouth, one from the top jaw and one from the bottom, that worked exactly how you think they worked. Most sharks just bite you and call it a day. EDESTUS would chomp down and literally slice you in half. These weren't individual teeth that could fall out and grow back. They were permanent tooth whorls that just kept growing throughout the shark's entire life, getting bigger and more ridiculous as the animal aged. The biggest specimens had tooth blades over 1/2 meter long. That's longer than most people's arms, just hanging out of this shark's face permanently, swimming around with garden shears for a mouth, cutting through schools of fish just because it could. Scientists spent decades trying to figure out how this thing actually used its dental equipment. Turns out EDESTUS didn't really bite prey in the traditional sense. It would swim vertically through groups of fish and just slash everything to pieces with its face. Efficient? Sure. Subtle? Not even close. What I would pay to actually see this thing hunt in real time, it probably looked ridiculous. What makes this even more ridiculous is that EDESTUS lived in coal swamps, which means it was terrorizing ancient fish while surrounded by giant ferns and dragonflies the size of seagulls. The whole ecosystem was already nightmare fuel, and then this thing shows up wielding face knives. The teeth were made of relatively soft cartilage too, which raises some questions about how effective they actually were against armored prey. But here's the thing, when you're swimming around with 1/2 meter scissors attached to your skull, probably don't need to worry too much about effectiveness. Most fish took one look at this monster and decided they had urgent business elsewhere. EDESTUS went extinct after ruling the coal swamp seas for millions of years. Not because the design didn't work, but because the whole swamp ecosystem collapsed when the climate changed, which means somewhere in an alternate timeline, there are still sharks swimming around with permanent scissors for teeth, just going about their day, cutting fish in half for no particular reason. The truly weird part is that no other shark ever tried this approach again. Evolution looked at EDESTUS, said, well, that was interesting, and went back to regular teeth. Sometimes the best ideas are also the most terrifying ones. And what you're gonna find throughout this video is that evolution did this a lot. They tried one thing super niche, super weird, and then never again. Ultimately, those are just 2 teeth though, so how bad could it be? Well, one creature had 45 tentacles in a horror movie name. Scientists discovered a creature with 45 tentacles and decided the most professional thing to do was name it after a fictional cosmic Lovecraftian god. Because apparently, when you're a paleontologist and you find something with that many arms, your first thought isn't fascinating echinoderm. It's this looks like it wants to drive people insane. Sollasina Cthulhu was about the size of a large spider, 2 inches across max, which means researchers looked at this tiny sea creature and thought, you know what this reminds me of? An ancient evil that devours souls and destroys minds. So it really puts into perspective these scientists' reading habits, because they must have been Cthulhu fans. The 45 tentacles weren't even soft and squishy. Each one was covered in little armor plates, making this thing look like it was wearing chainmail made specifically for appendages. It crawled around the seafloor 430 million years ago, presumably not driving anyone insane because brains hadn't really been invented yet. What's really wild is how they figured out what this thing was. Scientists had to grind down the fossil layer by layer and take pictures of each slice to build a 3D model. They spent months methodically destroying rocks just to see inside a creature smaller than a sandwich. The dedication to understanding something this weird is honestly impressive. The internal reconstruction showed Cthulhu had the same water system that modern sea cucumbers use to operate their tube feet. Except instead of having a reasonable number of tube feet, this thing decided 45 was the appropriate amount. Because why have 10 tentacles when you can have 4.5 times that many? It belonged to a group called Ophiocystoids, which were basically sea cucumbers that went completely overboard with the armor and appendage count. They're all extinct now, probably because having 45 anything is generally not a sustainable life strategy. The best part about this whole discovery is that it required cutting-edge 3D imaging technology to study a creature that lived before fish had jaws. We used computers and electron microscopes to understand an animal that predates most of the stuff we consider ancient. Cthulhu lived on the sea floor, used its ridiculous number of tentacles to grab food particles, and somehow made this setup work for millions of years before going extinct, which proves that sometimes evolution just throws stuff at the wall to see what sticks. And speaking of throwing stuff at the wall, one predator was built from 3 different animals. For decades, paleontologists confidently told the world they'd found 3 separate creatures from the Cambrian period. There was this weird shrimp thing, a mysterious jellyfish, and some kind of sponge. They gave them different names, wrote papers about them, put them in textbooks, you know, standard scientific procedure. Except they were completely wrong about all of it. In 1981, someone finally noticed that the shrimp was attached to the sponge, and the jellyfish was actually the mouth of the whole thing. Whoops. Turns out they've been studying one animal the entire time, which became the largest predator of its era once scientists figured out how to put it together correctly. This thing might not look impressive based on what we know about animals today, but this thing was massive for the Cambrian seas. It was 3 feet long when most other creatures were the size of your thumb. It had 2 giant arms sticking out of its head, covered in spikes, and compound eyes the size of dinner plates, and a circular mouth that opened and closed in sections. Basically everything you designed if you wanted to terrify small trilobites. The arms were what scientists first mistook for shrimp, which makes sense if you've never seen the rest of the animal, but it seems pretty embarrassing in hindsight. These weren't just random appendages, they were highly specialized prey-grabbing equipment that could sweep through the water and snatch up anything unfortunate enough to be swimming nearby. ANOMALOCARIS spent its days cruising above the sea floor, using those dinner plate eyes to spot movement, then swooping down to grab lunch with its spike-covered arms. The mouth would then do this horrifying pineapple ring thing where it opened up in segments to chomp down on whatever got delivered. The really embarrassing part is that pieces of this creature had been sitting in museum collections since the 1890s. Scientists spent almost a century confidently categorizing random body parts as separate species before anyone thought to check if maybe they belonged together. Once they got the whole picture, ANOMALOCARIS became famous as one of the first apex predators in Earth's history. It probably triggered an evolutionary arms race as every other creature suddenly needed better defenses against this swimming nightmare with grabby arms. The scientific community took this discovery pretty well, all things considered. Nobody likes admitting they've been teaching wrong information for 90 years, but at least they got a really cool prehistoric apex monster out of it. So at least that mix-up was accidental. But one fossil out there looks like science fiction on purpose, because paleontologists found a fossil with a head shaped exactly like the Millennium Falcon and decided to just lean into it. They officially nicknamed it the spaceship fossil in scientific papers, because apparently when you spend your career studying ancient sea creatures, you eventually reach a point where making Star Wars references becomes completely acceptable professional behavior. CAMBRORASTER had this massive horseshoe-shaped head shield that covered half of its body. The thing was so wide and flat that when scientists first saw it, someone immediately said, "That looks just like Han Solo's ship," and then the name just stuck. But the spaceship head wasn't just a pretty design. This creature was essentially a living vacuum cleaner that spent its time plowing through seafloor mud looking for snacks. The head shield worked as a shovel, stirring up sediment while its specialized front claws raked through the mess to catch anything edible. These claws were the weirdest part. Instead of normal grabbing arms, CAMBRORASTER had these comb-shaped appendages with rows of closely spaced spines. The gaps between spines were less than a millimeter apart, which means this thing could filter out incredibly tiny prey from the mud it was churning up. The discovery itself was pretty remarkable. Scientists found over 100 specimens in a single quarry, which suggests these creatures either lived in groups or all got buried at the same time. Either way, there was apparently a moment 506 million years ago when dozens of spaceship-headed monsters were crawling around the same patch of sea floor, just vacuuming up microscopic snacks. Which makes this discovery even better is that it solved a paleontology mystery. For years, scientists had been finding these weird isolated claw fragments that they couldn't identify. Nobody knew what animal they came from or how they were used. Then CAMBRORASTER showed up with its claws intact, and suddenly all those mystery pieces made sense. Ultimately, that's still a kind of normal animal though. But some creatures break basic rules about body design. Every animal on Earth follows certain basic design rules. You've got radial symmetry for things like jellyfish, bilateral symmetry for mostly everything else, and some echinoderms that do the five-fold thing. These are the established patterns that life has stuck with for hundreds of millions of years. TRIBRACHIDIUM looked at all of that and decided 3 was the magic number instead. This thing had threefold symmetry, which sounds reasonable until you realize that nothing alive today uses this design. Not one animal. It's mathematically weird, biologically pointless, and apparently evolution tried it once and then never bothered again. Picture a small disc sitting on the sea floor with 3 arms arranged in a perfect Y shape. That's this creature. It lived 558 million years ago, back when life was still figuring out what shapes were supposed to work. Most creatures from that time look strange, but at least they follow some kind of logic. This one just made up its own rules. The 3 arms were arranged in this spiral pattern that created natural whirlpools when water flowed over them. These little currents would funnel food particles into pits between the arms, where it could absorb them. So it wasn't just weird for the sake of being weird, the design actually worked. But that just makes it more frustrating that nothing else ever tried this approach, because it spent millions of years proving that threefold symmetry was a perfectly viable way to live, and evolution responded by completely abandoning the concept. It's the biological equivalent of inventing a better wheel and then forgetting how to make it. Scientists found thousands of these things fossilized together, which means they were successful enough to form big communities on the ancient sea floor. They had their feeding strategy figured out, they could reproduce effectively, they even had different species within the genus. By all measures, threefold symmetry was working great. Then the Cambrian period started and everything changed. New predators showed up, the seafloor ecosystem got disrupted, and suddenly being a stationary 3-armed filter feeder wasn't such a great strategy anymore. And it went extinct along with most of its weird Edicarian neighbors. The craziest part is that we only know about this creature because of exceptional preservation conditions. Most soft-bodied creatures from that time period just rotted away without leaving fossils, so there could have been dozens of other animals experimenting with threefold symmetry, and we'll just never know about them. You might be thinking that 3 arms might seem excessive, but wait till I tell you that one creature covered itself in hundreds of spikes. There are certain animals that make taxonomists want to quit their jobs and become accountants instead. WIWAXIA was one of them. Scientists spent decades arguing about whether this thing was a worm, a snail, or something else entirely. And the arguments got surprisingly heated for people who study 505 million-year-old rocks. The problem was that we had features from multiple animal groups stuck together in ways that shouldn't work. It crawled around on a muscular foot like a snail, but its back was covered in overlapping scales and defensive spines like some kind of armored worm. Add in a mouthful of tiny rasping teeth, and you've got a creature that seems designed specifically to confuse graduate students. Some researchers looked at those scales and said, definitely a polychaete worm. Others saw the rasping mouthparts and insisted it had to be related to mollusks. Both groups wrote papers. Both groups presented evidence. Both groups were probably wrong, but nobody wanted to admit it. The scales were arranged in neat rows across WIWAXIA's back, with 2 lines of longer spines sticking straight up for protection. This setup worked well enough that WIWAXIA became one of the more common creatures in the Burgess Shale, which means whatever it was good at not getting eaten. Recent evidence has been tilting toward the mollusk camp, which would make WIWAXIA an early relative of snails and clams that decided armor was more important than shells. Instead of growing protective shell like sensible mollusks, WIWAXIA covered itself in hundreds of individual scales and called it a day. The mouth situation just made everything more complicated. WIWAXIA had multiple rows of small conical teeth that it used to scrape algae and organic matter off the sea floor. This feeding style looked familiar to researchers who study modern mollusks, which helped push the classification towards that group. But honestly, the whole debate misses the bigger point. WIWAXIA represents this period in evolutionary history where animals were still experimenting with basic body plans. Some of these experiments worked and led to modern animal groups. Others, like covering yourself in hundreds of scales while crawling around on a small foot, didn't catch on. The classification argument will probably continue until someone finds more complete fossils or develops better ways to analyze ancient genetic relationships. Until then, WIWAXIA remains this beautifully confusing reminder that evolution again tried a lot of weird stuff before settling on the designs we see today. So yeah, identity crises are one thing, but wait till I tell you that some animals from prehistory had eyes bigger than dinner plates. This isn't even a small creature. This one is quite large. Paleontologists kept finding ichthyosaur fossils with bone damage that looked exactly like decompression sickness. You know, the bends. The thing that happens to deep sea divers who surface too quickly and get nitrogen bubbles in their bloodstream. Except these were 150 million-year-old marine reptiles, not modern humans with scuba gear. The bone lesions were unmistakable. These creatures had been diving so deep and surfacing so fast that they were literally injuring themselves in the process, which raises the obvious question: what could possibly be worth giving yourself the bends for? Well, meet Ophthalmosaurus, the ichthyosaur that apparently decided risking permanent injury was preferable to missing out on deep water snacks. This thing had eyes the size of volleyballs, nearly 9 inches across, which made them the largest eyes relative to body size of any vertebrate that's ever lived. Those massive eyes weren't just there to look freaky. They had incredibly wide pupils that could gather light in conditions where most animals would be completely blind. Ophthalmosaurus was built for hunting in the deep ocean twilight zone, where squid and fish hang out in near total darkness thinking they're safe from predators. But here's where it gets interesting. Early ichthyosaurs from the Triassic period don't show these diving injuries. Their bones are fine. It was only later species like Ophthalmosaurus that started showing up with decompression damage, which suggests something changed in their environment that forced them to dive deeper and more aggressively. The leading theory is that as sharks and other predators became more common in shallow waters, ichthyosaurs got pushed into deeper hunting grounds. They had to go where the competition wasn't, even if it meant risking their health every time they went fishing. So Ophthalmosaurus developed this extreme deep diving lifestyle where it would plunge into the abyss, grab whatever it could find with its massive eyes guiding the way, then rocket back to the surface before its air ran out. Sometimes this worked fine, sometimes it gave itself nitrogen poisoning. The fossil record shows these injuries were pretty common, which means Ophthalmosaurus was regularly choosing to hunt in conditions that were borderline dangerous. It's the prehistoric equivalent of extreme sports, except instead of doing it for fun, they were doing it because all the good food had moved to places that could kill you. Evolution pushed these animals into increasingly risky behavior just to survive, and they kept doing it for millions of years despite the obvious health consequences. But it makes sense, having giant eyes for hunting in such low light conditions is pretty practical. But wait till I tell you about an animal that grew feathers before flight existed. By now you probably realize that evolution has terrible timing. Sometimes it invents features 50 billion years before they become useful, then acts surprised when nobody knows what to do with them. Case in point, LONGISQUAMA grew elaborate feather-like structures all over its back during the Triassic period, which would have been great if flight via feathers had been invented yet. But it hadn't. Birds and other animals that flew with feathers wouldn't show up for another 50 million years. And here's this little lizard running around with 6 enormous plumes sticking out from its spine, each one longer than its entire body. The whole setup looked like someone had glued fancy feathers to a regular reptile as a prank. The structures weren't even functional for gliding, which was everyone's first guess about what they might be for. Computer models showed that LONGISQUAMA couldn't have used them as wings even if it wanted to. They were too stiff, positioned wrong, and probably would have just made the animal fall out of trees faster. So what were they for? The current best guess is that LONGISQUAMA was basically showing off. These were display structures designed to impress mates or intimidate rivals, which means this animal evolved elaborate feather-like appendages just to make itself look more attractive. What's interesting is that the internal structure of these plumes looked remarkably similar to actual bird feathers, with a central shaft and hollow spaces that could have been inflated with blood or air. This suggests that whatever genetic pathways eventually led to flight feathers were already being experimented with millions of years earlier. But the timing creates this weird evolutionary puzzle. Why would natural selection favor such elaborate display structures in a small Triassic reptile? These things must have been metabolically expensive to grow and maintain. Not to mention, they probably made the LONGISQUAMA much more visible to predators. The answer might be that sexual selection can drive evolution in directions that seem completely impractical from a survival standpoint. If female LONGISQUAMAs were attracted to males with bigger, more colorful plumes, then evolution would keep making those plumes more extreme regardless of whether they helped with anything else. This whole situation perfectly captures how messy and non-linear evolution actually is. Features don't actually appear when they are needed. Sometimes they show up way too early, get used for something completely different, and then get repurposed millions of years later when the right ecological conditions finally exists. But at least those feathers were on the right body part. The next creature I'm going to tell you about decided to put its wings on their legs. And this creature is so strange, and it is another thing where evolution tried this once and never again. And after you hear what I'm about to tell you, you're gonna see exactly why. Only one fossil of SHAROVIPTERYX has ever been found, which means we're looking at probably the most abandoned evolutionary experiment in Earth's history. Evolution tried this design exactly once, looked at the results, and immediately decided it was drunk and having a bad day that day. So what was so disturbing about this little reptile that natural selection just pretended it never happened? Well, SHAROVIPTERYX put its wings on its legs instead of its arms. Not both, just the legs. The front limbs stayed tiny and useless while the back legs grew enormous wing membranes that stretched out in a delta formation. This is the equivalent of inventing the airplane but putting the wings on the landing gear. It shouldn't work. It looks ridiculous, and yet computer modeling shows the SHAROVIPTERYX could actually glide pretty effectively using this backwards setup. The tiny front arms worked as little stabilizers while the leg wings did all the heavy lifting. The single fossil comes from Central Asia and dates to about 225 million years ago, right before pterosaurs showed up and demonstrated the correct way to do powered flight, which makes SHAROVIPTERYX this weird footnote in aviation history. It's the creature that figured out flight but installed everything upside down. The wing membranes connected the elongated leg bones to the body and tail, creating what engineers would recognize as a delta wing configuration. Modern aircraft use this design because it's stable and maneuverable, which suggests that SHAROVIPTERYX wasn't just randomly flailing around in the air. It had worked out some legitimate aerodynamics, but apparently nobody else was impressed. No other reptile ever tried leg wings. Pterosaurs stuck with arm wings, birds eventually did the same thing, and even bats went with the traditional arm wing setup. SHAROVIPTERYX's approach died with that single individual fossilized in Central Asian rocks. The really frustrating part is that we'll probably never know how well this design actually worked in practice. Was SHAROVIPTERYX an amazing glider that just got unlucky with the fossil record, or was it an evolutionary dead end that couldn't compete with more conventional flying reptiles? One fossil isn't enough to answer those questions, but it's enough to prove that evolution was apparently drunk during the Triassic period and thought putting wings on legs was a reasonable idea. Sometimes the most innovative solutions are also the most completely wrong ones. The fact that nothing alive today even remotely resembles SHAROVIPTERYX suggests that conventional wisdom won this particular evolutionary argument. But still, you have to respect the audacity. Evolution will do what evolution wants to do, and this video just proves that. If you enjoyed watching this video, let me know down below which of these creatures was your favorite to learn about, and like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content just like this. If you want to watch another video from our channel, click the video on screen now.